Hello, everyone. How do you like all this snow we're having? It's a lot of it, isn't it? I think it's kind of fun though myself. But what the heck? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Mundy, and that's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation. And this recording is being broadcast on Monday, February the 22nd. So February, as we know, is Black History Month. And even though I think every month is Black History Month, as every month is Women's History Month and History Month in general, we're going to take advantage of this situation in February to talk about the Union League's first Black member, William Thaddeus Coleman, Jr., who joined in February of 1974. So why don't we get right into the story, because it's a really fascinating story. This one is just a whole lot of fun. So I'm going to go right into my share screen, right, so I can show you the PowerPoint. There we are, but I need to do, come on. There we go. There we go. Okay. 112 years later. I picked that title because the league was organized in 1862, and it was in 1974, 112 years later, that the league admitted its first Black member. So it seemed appropriate. So here we go. All right. William Thaddeus Coleman Jr. was born in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. His father, William Thaddeus Coleman Sr., was a nationally known social worker, and he was also the director of the Wissahickon Boys Club. His mother was a German teacher, so it was a very intellectual, cultural, middle-class Black family living in Germantown. And the family was so well known that they would have some really interesting dinner guests. For instance, the great sociologist W.E. Du Bois and the poet Langston Hughes were frequent dinner guests in the house. And you can imagine then the level of conversation that young Bill Coleman was subjected to. My gosh, must have been astounding and amazing. But he was a bright kid. I went to Roosevelt Junior High School, where he was in the honors class, one of the, I think, number one kid in his class there. And there was a story, and it gives you an idea, though, what it was like to be a Black student in a predominantly white high school in Philadelphia in the 1930s. So he had just given a presentation in an English class, and a very good one. I mean, he thought he had nailed it, but his teacher basically rewarded him by saying, William, that was very nice, but maybe eventually someday you'll be a chauffeur. And apparently he replied in a very unpolite manner and was eventually suspended from the school. But went back to the school, graduated, and then went on to Germantown High School, which at that point was one of the top academic high schools in the city's system. He was one of only 7 Black students in Germantown at that point in time. And he would eventually graduate first in his class from Germantown High School. But Germantown wasn't any friendlier than Roosevelt, unfortunately. Coleman was a very athletic young man, swimmer, went to join the swim team. And rather than integrating the swim team, they simply disbanded the team. And the day after he graduated from high school, the team was reorganized. So that was the length to which they went to keep him and any of our Blacks off the swim team. So although surprisingly and ironically, Coleman went on to say later on that it was the swim coach that wrote him his best letter of recommendation for the University of Pennsylvania, which is where he went to college. So he graduated Germantown in 1938, went to Penn, graduated in 1941 with a dual major of political science and economics, and he graduated summa cum laude. So the brains are there, clearly. And from Penn, he would go on to the Harvard Law School. So let's take a look at this. Okay. At Harvard Law, and as you can imagine, there weren't very many Black students at the Harvard Law School, let alone Harvard University. But he was the 3rd Black law school student to sit on the Harvard Law Review Board, only the 3rd. And that was a well-deserved and honor, as you can imagine. You can see Bill Coleman sitting in the front row, second from the left. And you can see he's the only Black student on, sitting in that picture there. So he's at Harvard Law School. World War II comes along. He enlists in 1942 in the Army Air Corps. He wanted to be a Tuskegee Airman, but as he said in his own words, he washed out. And instead, he ends up doing legal work for the U.S. Army, basically working court-martials, defending soldiers in court-martials. And of the 18 cases in which he presented the case. He won 16 of the 18, and a 17th was later overturned in his favor. So obviously, without even being a lawyer yet, he's practicing law and doing a darn good job at it. And that would go on to prove what he would do, what he could do. So he would go back to actually 1945. He would get married and eventually had 3 children. His wife, Lucinda Hardin, all right, and 3 children. And he would eventually end up living in Mount Airy, believe it or not. So, but anyway, but let's get back to the story here. Harvard Law School, graduates 1946, all right? First in his class at Harvard Law School. I mean, just think about what that means. Think of all the doors that should have opened up, actually, all right? I mean, that should have opened up every legal door in this country. Well, first, he wants to be a law clerk. So he comes back to Philadelphia in 1947 and clerks for Judge Herbert Goodrich in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based here in Philadelphia. And then in 1948, though, he becomes one of the 2 clerks for Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. And he becomes the first Black Supreme Court judge clerk. Okay, so you've heard he's the first of this and the first of that before, haven't you? So that's going to be obviously a theme in his life. And a heck of a life it was. So he ends up with Felix Frankfurter in 1947. And actually, this is him in the Army. Sorry, I forgot I had the slide. Okay. All right. And then here we have Justice Frankfurter on the left-hand side and his wife Marion on the right-hand side. And Frankfurter was a fascinating character. There's a great biography on him that I think just any biography, and it's going to be fun stuff. Frankfurter expected his clerks to be cultural, intellectual, educated. I mean, polymaths, the whole 9 yards. But he expected them to write well, and apparently he didn't think Coleman could, and so he persuaded his wife to teach Coleman writing lessons, and 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 days a week, and for the first month that he was a clerk. And apparently by the end of the month, Marion Frankfurter told her husband that, your clerk writes better than you do. So she was a very good teacher, and Coleman was a very good student. So, and once you're a member of Frankfurter's larger family, you stayed a member forever. So he and Coleman remained good friends until Frankfurter's death later on. The other clerk in Frankfurter's office at the time was his Harvard classmate, Eliot Richards. You can see him there on the right-hand side. They made it a habit of going out to lunch every day. And at lunch, they would read poetry or recite Shakespeare. And it wasn't easy to do that, though, because in Washington, D.C., restaurants, especially in hotels, were still segregated. And it opened up both their eyes to a lot of different situations. And they would remain lifelong friends as well. Richardson would eventually become the godfather for Bill Coleman's daughter, Lovinda. So close personal and family friends for the rest of their lives as well. So the clerkship was over in 1949. Coleman comes back to Philadelphia. And as I said, geez, let's see, you're first at Harvard Law School. You should be able to walk into any law firm in the country and get a job, not in Philadelphia. You've heard me say before that Philadelphia in the 19th and 20th centuries was known as one of the most, if not the most, racist city in the country. And every law firm closed its doors to Bill Coleman. He ends up going to New York for 3 years. The firm was called Paul Weiss, Warden and Garrison. And he would work there for 3 years and then come back to Philadelphia in 1952 when Richardson Dilworth was forming his own firm, actually Dilworth, Paxson, Kalish, and Levy. And he would hire Coleman in 1952. And one of the impetuses behind that was Dilworth's, one of his, probably his best customer, a fellow named Walter Annenberg. You may have heard of him once or twice. So Annenberg's influence helped get Coleman the job. And within 5 years, Coleman was already a partner in the firm. So when he would leave the firm later on, it would be known as Dilworth, Paxson, Kalish, Levy, and Coleman. So, but anyway. All right. So while Coleman was in New York, he was introduced to Thurgood Marshall, who at this point is working on the Legal Defense Fund for the NAACP, right? Okay. And here we go. And there is Thurgood Marshall in the middle. And he would recruit Bill Coleman to help him do some legal work for the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund specifically. Coleman and Marshall will become the chief plaintiff writers for what would become known as Brown versus the Board of Education, that famous 1954 Supreme Court decision that separate is not equal. So, and here you see this photograph there in Washington, D.C., in front of the Supreme Court building. That is Wiley Brandt on the right-hand side, another lawyer working for the LDF at that point in time. So, and Coleman would continue his affiliation with the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP for many, many, many years. And here they are, another photograph of them in Washington, D.C. And actually, Coleman would become chairman of the board of the LDF from 1977 to 1997. So very much involved with it. So a very quiet man. He wasn't one that one would ever associate with civil rights activism in the 1950s and 1960s. But behind the scenes, he was as involved as anybody else, and more than most, to be honest. So that's that. And here we you can see the this piece from the actual Supreme Court appeal. So there you go. All right. And you can see Coleman's name, lower left-hand corner. But he and Marshall are considered the two architects of that, basically, who wrote most of the legal briefs for it. So Coleman comes, so he's in Philadelphia, and he becomes known as a transportation expert. He would become involved in railroad transportation, public transportation, SEPTA, well, the old Philadelphia Transportation Company, and then which became SEPTA, Penn Central, and at one point he was even on the board of the Pan American Airlines. So he was he was building this national reputation for being an expert, as they say, in transportation, but becoming a Philadelphia lawyer. I mean, he looks like one, doesn't he? He looks great. Just a very dignified looking man. And things are going along well. They're happily living in West Monroe with his family on West Porter Street. And in 1973, he was proposed for membership in the Union League of Philadelphia. And why not? But again, it was going to be kind of a repeat in some ways of the early 1950s, because not every member wanted to have a black member in the league. Now, Coleman, back in those days, you had to have a proposer, a seconder, 6 sponsors, and then other kind of letter writers. Now, Coleman's proposer was no less than John B. Hannum, who was a U.S. district judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Quite a reputation, quite a traditionalist. His seconder was none other than Thomas B. McCabe, who you might have heard about a couple of weeks ago when he did a whole program on Mr. McCabe himself, when he served in Harry Truman's administration. And McCabe, at this point, is the chairman of the Scott Paper Company, one of Philadelphia's few Fortune 500 companies. And McCabe is a powerhouse in Philadelphia and the league. He's a past president of the league. He was president in 1962. Among his sponsors were William Cashel, the president of the Bell Telephone Company of Pennsylvania, Honorable Francis Van Dusen, district judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals, Frank Tarbox, president of Penn Mutual Life Insurance Company, and Louis T. Clotter, who was the head of Louis T. Clotter and Associates, which is one of the country's leading railroad engineering firms, for instance. And Louis Clotter would become a president of the league in the 1980s. So just a really powerful collection of sponsors for his membership. And yet, there were still murmurs, and a lot of members objected because they simply didn't want, they didn't think that having a black member of the league would be good for the league. But as you can imagine, those members were basically ignored because the membership committee decided that it would be good for the league to have a black member. And so William Thaddeus Coleman Jr. became the league's first black member admitted in February of 1974. Okay, so anyway, that's that. All right, so let's get on with this. 1975, a year later, now President Gerald Ford is putting his cabinet together, and his very first choice for a cabinet position was to make Bill Coleman his Secretary of Transportation, which would be approved by the U.S. Senate, and Coleman would become only the second black cabinet member in American history. Robert Weaver was the first under LBJ in 1966. And Coleman specifically requested that Thurgood Marshall, who is now a Supreme Court justice, swear him into his position. And there you have Marshall on the left-hand side, getting ready to do just that. And so here's Coleman with President Gerald Ford. That is Elaine Jones, who was Coleman's special assistant in the Department of Transportation, and she would later on to become the fourth director counsel of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. So she herself was a rising star in African-American legal issues, and then debuted on the NAACP. So, and here we have the president and his secretary of transportation. And Coleman's had a couple of big things to do while he was secretary, one of which was to oversee the creation of Conrail, all right, Consolidated Rail Corporation. And that is one of his legacy achievements, that and allowing the Concorde to land in New York City and things like that. So, so that was that. All right. So Mr. Coleman would leave office when Ford's presidency was over. And rather than coming back to Philadelphia, he would become employed at the Washington, D.C. law firm of O'Melveny and Myers. And he would stay in Washington, D.C. the rest of his life, unfortunately. Now, it would take a half hour to read the list of things he did. I mean, he served under 7 presidents, all the different government committees he served on, let alone the civil rights activities he was still involved with, and just all the other honors he was accumulating. I mean, literally, it's astounding what he did and accomplished in his life. He never forgot he was from Philadelphia, so here he is receiving an award from the Community College of Philadelphia. And here he is with Vernon Jordan, the national chairman of the NAACP, in the center. Jack Greenberg on the left-hand side, who was the second director counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Coleman on the right-hand side. As I mentioned, Coleman was the chairman of the LDF for 20 years. And then in 1995, President Bill Clinton awarded Bill Coleman with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award in this country. And then 2 years later, 1997, he would receive the Thurgood Marshall Lifetime Achievement Award from the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. So he would gather awards for the rest of his life. So, and unfortunately, his life would end in 2017. He was 97 years old, if you can imagine that. So, and in what I think bespeaks to the character and humility of a great man is where they lie in rest. And Bill Coleman was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And you can see his grave marker there in the right-hand corner. And in the upper left-hand corner is the old Custis Lee mansion from the Civil War period. So I think there's a lot of symbolism in this as well. I wish I had more time to talk about Bill Coleman, because he was just an absolutely fascinating character who deserves a lot more recognition than I'm humbly able to give him. So I hope you've enjoyed at least this episode and learning about the League's first Black member, William Thaddeus Coleman Jr. So there you go. All right, folks. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the snow and go get your virus vaccine. All right. So we'll see you next week. And by the way, I shout out to the Legacy Foundation for their willingness to keep putting me in front of a camera and talking to you. I'm hopefully not boring you at all. So we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, and goodbye.